Hey there, I'm back. We're going to now keep continuing to talk about the CNS, and we're in the diencephalon, which is where those notes were that you saw at the beginning of the page, or beginning of the video, and we're going to continue on right here. This is the top of page 6 of your lecture notes. So the diencephalon, it's made up of 3 different areas. We talked about this last time briefly: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epithalamus. All right, hypo means below, epi means above. Interestingly, the epithalamus is over here, and you'd say, well, that's not above, that's off posteriorly to the thalamus, which is this big thing. However, think about when it was first identified. It was identified in animals, and animals' heads are pointing downward, so this would be epithalamus. This would be up towards the top of the animal. Hypothalamus is right here below it, and that makes sense for us. All right, now let's talk about these. We're going to go over a little bit of information on each, not a ton of info, but some nice basics, and we'll see how far we can get today. Okay, so we first have the thalamus in the diencephalon, and there are 2 oval masses above the midbrain, and actually, I think I want to show you a picture of this. I'm going to pause for a brief second and bring this up on the book. All right, I'm back here, and you can see I've gone into the book for a minute. Now, there is the thalamus, and so let's look in here for a second. So here's the 2 oval masses right in the center of our kind of brain structure, and you can see them here in a close-up, okay? And they have tons of nuclei, and remember, nuclei mean groups of cell bodies in the CNS, so that's what we're seeing. And what I'm going to tell you right now is you don't need to memorize all of these nuclei, which is good, because there's a lot of them. All right, both in the thalamus and over here, you can see the hypothalamus just below it has a bunch of nuclei. Few of these nuclei we will talk about in 233 when we get to what the hypothalamus does in endocrine. But I just wanted to show you how that looks and kind of the shape of it. And also remember the lateral, the third ventricle kind of goes through these oval masses. So these oval masses make up the walls of the third ventricle. So let's highlight some things now about the thalamus. What does the thalamus do? Well, what its primary function, that's what that's supposed to mean, their primary function, is to classify and read information and relay it to the cortex. A lot of times you'll see me say that this is kind of like a switching center. And a switching center is where information would come in from somewhere and then go out again. Back in the old days, switching centers were like in the early telephones. There was physically a person sitting somewhere in front of a big board, and they had little wires, and if someone made a phone call, they would take the wire from that person's phone line and then put it in the switching board and then put an outgoing switch in the same spot and then could connect people. Nowadays, a better way might say like a router. Right, a router is taking information in, deciding what to do with it, switching it out, sending it somewhere else. So, so there's kind of a computer-related way to think about it. So the thalamus is really important because almost all fibers coming from our sensory information of our body go through the thalamus, and then the thalamus kind of rearranges the information, decides how to classify it, and sends it to different parts of the cortex. Okay, it's mostly then gray matter. It's mostly made up of lots of nuclei. It's held together by the intermediate mass, which are some neuron processes that are unmyelinated, and it forms the walls of the third ventricle, as I just said a minute ago. It has a little tiny bit of white matter in it, but it's almost all gray matter. Now, this, in that picture that I showed you, shows a lot of these different nuclei right here. Okay, and I'm going to say for you to more read for interest. All right, we're not going to cover each nuclei and what the nuclei does. But you can kind of, when you look at it, you can think, oh, there are nuclei that do hearing, there are nuclei that do vision, there are nuclei that will send things to the somatosensory region. There are ones that are getting information from the motor system. Now, the other thing to think about is information coming in goes through the thalamus, right? And there are there's information that goes out through the thalamus, like voluntary motor actions, all right? It is involved with some emotions and memories. There is some perception that occurs here in the thalamus, very small amount. That is all I'm going to say about that for now. We'll talk more about the thalamus as we bring fibers up from the periphery into the body, and we'll go and use the thalamus again and talk more about it. Okay? Now the next one is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is below the thalamus, and it's kind of protected by the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone, if you might remember, and the pituitary gland actually is below it and lies in there, and the pituitary gland hangs off of the hypothalamus, and that's what this says right here. It lies above the pituitary gland and attached to the pituitary gland by the infundibulum, which is the little stalk that connects it. And the hypothalamus' really main job is its nuclei control many of the body activities. It's very homeostasis related. It also integrates the autonomic nervous system and regulates visceral activities. All right, viscera are organs. So that's important. It also is an intermediary, and I'm going to put this in a different color so you can just make sure you note it, between the nervous system and the endocrine system, because the hypothalamus produces hormones and regulates the pituitary gland, which also produces hormones. So this is a part of the brain that is kind of right on the edge of being an endocrine type gland and the nervous system brain center. So it does both. And we'll talk much more about that in 233. Okay? It also contributes to the limbic system, and we're going to briefly talk about the limbic system later, but what we'll say about it, and I'll just kind of highlight these two things, is it does primal emotion processing and release. And so emotional responses, especially ones around like rage and aggression and other very primal emotions, can be directed via the hypothalamus. Now, some of the homeostasis related things. Okay, so we can even type that in up here. Why don't we type in homeostasis related functions? So one is thermoregulation. It controls body temperature. All right, it helps control body temperature. It uses information from the thermoreceptors in the brain and in the entire body, on the outside of your body, on the inside of your body, and it's going to tell the body to sweat, to shiver, to do whatever it needs to maintain a constant body temperature. Okay? The second one is food intake regulation. It's going to look at changing blood levels of certain food stuffs like glucose, amino acids, fats, fatty acids, glycerols, and also looks at hormone levels, and it's going to decide whether we need to eat more or less food. So the first, there's really two centers. There's a hunger feeding center, and then there's a satiation center, and that really is kind of asking the question, am I full or not? So hunger and feeding is just about the act of like, I need food and I want to then start to obtain food, but then the satiation center is like, well, have I now eaten enough food? And fortunately, sometimes this center isn't in line with our receptors in our stomach, and we overeat as a result, because it takes time for our stomach and our small intestine to break down foodstuffs and then absorb them. So your hypothalamus might be getting information that we don't have enough blood glucose and we don't have any amino acids and fats, and you've already eaten a giant meal, and it keeps saying, well, no, but I haven't seen those things yet because they haven't been broken down and put in the bloodstream. And so sometimes we overeat a little. If we could slow our eating down and take our time, we would probably do a little bit better. The third one is thirst regulation, and this will trigger fluid intake either by drinking more fluid or by hormonal action. And what the hormonal action does is to reabsorb water at the kidneys, all right? And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, is part of this. We'll talk about that another time, but it's actually released, it's produced in the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary. And it will control fluid intake. So osmoreceptors in the vessels of the body, the kidneys and also other areas, sense low volume or low solute concentration and sends messages up to the hypothalamus. Okay. The fourth thing that it does is it's part of the sleep-wake cycle, our circadian rhythm, and it really works a lot with, it works with its counterpart, works with the epithalamus to do this. The epithalamus has another name that you might have heard of more, which is the pineal gland. And the pineal gland, I mean, it's only part of the epithalamus, but that's the part that we think of the most. And what the pineal gland does is it secretes melatonin. And melatonin levels increase as the day goes on. So they're very low in the morning and the afternoon, and about mid-afternoon to late afternoon, they start to creep up and kind of peak probably around 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night, and it gets us starting to get tired. And so it regulates our biological clock, which is approximately 24 hours a day. It's actually a little bit longer than that, and it's part of that sleep-wake cycle. Now, unsurprisingly, sleep cycles and melatonin release probably has some control over moods along with the hypothalamus. If we don't get enough sleep, our moods definitely change, and the melatonin levels may contribute to that. We'll talk more about hormonal things of these when we get all the way into 233 and spend a whole couple weeks on the endocrine system. Okay, so we're going to move on to the brainstem. Now the brainstem includes the midbrains, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, those three centers. And you can see in the little picture here off to the right, these are the very three lowest structures before we get to the spinal cord. And these provide automatic behaviors or autonomic behaviors. These are behaviors that are necessary for survival that you have involuntary control over, meaning that you don't choose to do these things. They just happen as part of your daily living. And that's great because a lot of these things are like breathing and controlling heart rate and things like that where you don't want to think about those things. You just want to have them happen. Now, 10 of the 12 cranial nerves come out of this area. You need to know all 12 cranial nerves' name, number, and their function for both lecture exams and lab exams. And we're going to start talking about those just in a couple minutes, and we'll go through them. Okay? So the first one is the midbrain, and this is the topmost one. Now, what I want to say before we move on is you're going to see these cross sections. I'm going to switch over to the book here for a second. So here we were with the thalamus. There's information about the hypothalamus and the epithalamus, so you can read those. But we want to get to this. Now, I want to show you this picture. This is a picture that I think you have to do in one of your labs as well. What we've done is we've taken the entire diencephalon and brainstem and removed it so we can see it together. So here is our two oval masses of our thalamus. There's our hypothalamus right there. Okay, and then right here you see we have the midbrain, we have the pons, and we have the medulla oblongata, all in different shades of green. All of the yellow structures coming off are all of those cranial nerves that we just talked about. 10 of the 12 are listed there. Okay, now you don't need to memorize this, although you're going to start needing to know some features of each of these three things. What I also want to show you is then we can take cross sections of these. We can take and draw a little line right through here, or right through here, or right through here, and we can go ahead and look at different structures, and that's what we're seeing here. See this page, figure 1215. This is in your book on page 453, and I'll put that in your notes in a minute. We've taken a cross-section of the midbrain, we've taken a cross-section here of the pons, and we've taken a cross-section of the medulla oblongata. Those are in our lecture notes, and we're going to cover each of those right now. And don't worry, you don't need to memorize every single thing that's happening in there. I'm going to highlight a few structures that are important, and those are the ones that I want you to focus on. Okay? Let's go back to our notes. So there's our first one right there. There's the midbrain. And the midbrain, as we said, we took a cross section, and we're looking at that cross section. Okay. So the midbrain is between the diencephalon above and the pons below, and it ends just above the foramen magnum, where the spinal cord goes in and out of the cranium. And so there's a couple things I want you to note. One is these things called cerebral peduncles. And cerebral peduncles, which are right here, cerebral peduncles, I get to go off the page there, but you can see that, are these bulges that you see on the ventral side, all right? And these contain corticospinal tracts. And corticospinal tracts are motor efferent fibers that convey impulses from the cortex to the pons and through to the spinal cord, all right? So they're motor fibers, they're going out. And I'm going to just make a little note right here that says we will discuss later. So we're going to talk about these corticospinal tracts later, but for now at least you can see that they exist there, and you can see them. These tracks are, right in here, right inside there. All right. They, what do these do? They also contain sensory fibers. They also contain sensory afferent fibers from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and they go to the cerebellum. Okay, so they are sending messages to the cerebellum as well. And there are different peduncles in the cerebellum, a superior one and a medial one and an inferior one. Okay, and so these are other little bulges that are in the cerebellum. So it sends information from the cortex out to the spinal cord that are motor. It also sends sensory fibers from the spinal cord and the thalamus to the cerebellum for the cerebellum to work, which we'll talk about later. Now, there's also a cerebral aqueduct, and the aqueduct is this little opening right here. We talked about it already, right? And that is the part that communicates the third and fourth ventricles. I'll just write aqueduct, okay, right there. And it connects the third and fourth ventricles in the midbrain, right? And then we have the corpora quadrigemina. And the corpora quadrigemina, if you think of that word, quad is four, and Gemini twins, so two sets of twins, four different things. And you can see this, if I go back to here, go back up, the four sets of twins are 1, 2, 3, 4 right here, the superior colliculi and the inferior colliculi. And those are posterior. We're looking at a posterior view there of the midbrain. Now, one thing you want to start thinking about is we talked about how you have involuntary control of things here. The things that are going to occur here are things that your body takes care of that you don't have to think about. And there's a lot of very primal things going on. And this is a really good example of this. So the corpora quadrigemina, and I'll put it in a different color just to highlight it out here, have these large nuclei on the back, these 4 in total nuclei. The 2 on top are superior colliculi, and the bottom 2 are inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi are a reflex center for visual tracking, all right? And this is where your head, neck, and eyes respond to visual stimuli, and your head turns due to things in your peripheral vision. So if we were in a classroom right now and I took a ball and I threw the ball along the side of the classroom, you would see that ball in your peripheral vision, and you wouldn't even choose to do it, but your head would move and your eyes would move to track that ball, because you're trying to see, is that something that's going to hit me? Is that something I need to be aware of? And the superior colliculi do this. It's a reflex. It's unconscious. The inferior colliculi has got a similar one, which is an auditory reflex center, which is our startle reflex. And this is where if someone comes up behind you and yells, boo, and you jump, your head and trunk especially will kind of contract, and it's you preparing yourself because something's scaring you, and you're trying to get your body ready and your head ready to see what's going on and react to it. Okay, and so this is in response to auditory stimuli. Head and trunk movement in response to auditory stimuli. All right, the last two things we want to talk about here is the substantia nigra, all right, and the red nucleus. And so the nigra is right here, and what I usually do, and I'm going to do it here because we just don't have a lot of room to type in things, is I'm going to make, and I can do it in different colors, I guess. So we'll do one in kind of a grayish color, and we'll put a little star right here. Okay, and then we'll do one in a reddish color because it's called the red nucleus, and we'll put a little dot right there. Okay, so the the red nucleus is this one right here. Okay, there's my little dot, and the substantia nigra is right below it, and the little star right there. Okay, so what do these guys do? We'll change our color up here. Substantia nigra is this pigmented nucleus, and it does subconscious muscle control. Again, something you don't have control over. It's involuntary. It's going to obviously work with the cerebellum, which also does muscle control. The red nucleus is red due to increased vascularization, and there's also iron pigments in here which make it red. And this is the origin of cell bodies of the rubrospinal tract. All right, ruby, red spinal tract, and these relay important information to descending motor pathways, and they help coordinate muscle movement. And I'm going to put a little note here again. We're going to talk about this later. So discuss the rubrospinal tract later. Okay? So this little section here we will discuss at another time. Those. Okay? Now, our first cranial nerves are seen here. The oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 3, and the trochlear nerve, cranial nerve 4 are here. So again, you need to know their name, their number, and their function. So the oculomotor nerve, guess what? It innervates the external eye and the upper eyelid muscles, and it mediates a lot of eye movement. So it mediates a lot of eye movement. It changes the size of the pupil and the lens shape. Does quite a bit. The trochlear nerve innervates part of the eye muscle, the superior oblique one, and it moves the eyeball down and lateral. Okay, so great. Now, let's next go to, actually, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to take a break here because we're about 25 minutes in, and we'll do the pons, and we will do the medulla oblongata, and we will do the cerebellum all in the last lecture, okay? So I think we're going to stop here, and a good place to pause, and we will pick up the rest of the midbrain on the next lecture. Okay, thanks.